United Lutheran Seminary presents the Seminary Explores podcast, conversations on faith, art, people, politics, theology, life, and more, with voices from around the corner and around the globe.
Good day. Welcome to the Seminary Explorers. Today, my guest is Dr. William Buckley, adjunct professor instructor in the Doctor of Liberal Studies program in the School of Continuing Studies, Georgetown University. Welcome to the Seminary Explorers.
Thank you very much, Nelson. I'm delighted to be here. I welcome our ELCA friends, and I have great memories of my Gettysburg colleagues, including you, and I'm delighted to share this time with you.
Well, it's a delight to be with you, and without further delay, I'm just going to get right into the questions or my inquiry. And I'm going to begin with a question. In an article by Finan O'Toole, a columnist for the Irish Times and advertising editor of the New York Review, he states the most immediately striking thing about Provost is that he embodies the hybrid nature of the country. Provost's blood is Afro-Creole, French, Italian, and Spanish. His maternal grandparents were people of color in New Orleans. What are your thoughts on his ethnicity and election as the second pope to be in the Americas?
Thank you for asking this very important question. In summary, I think Leo's family history, personal history, and journey retell difference in our time as what Leo calls in his January migration message, not a journey of abjection, but a journey of hope. And I think this is a very important and telling message for your question about both ethnicity and your later questions about migration. Let me explain what I mean. It's conventional knowledge among academics and those of us who have trained persons in ministry that internalized difference has diverse stories. You note vividly from our Irish colleague that what H.L. Gates said in the New York Times, that Leo's connection wonderfully vividly, Gates called genomic cosmopolitanism. That is, that Leo is international, he's black, he has slaveholders, he has freedom fighters, and he has famous cousins, Trudeau, Bieber, Kerouac, Madonna. And so what Gates does in his wonderful essay is a lot like what our Irish colleague does. He said, look at these marvelous connections, and he celebrates these connections. Now, retelling difference as positive because blended is a kind of vital reimagination of difference as positive. And I believe our Irish colleague will recognize this retelling because Viking is a job description, not heredity or ethnicity. And this has been shown in genetic and cell studies. So much so, you'll appreciate this. When my wife and I were in Dublin at the Irish National Museum, Viking tags were being retitled Scandinavian. And this wasn't just a sulk to Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian tourists, but it was a recognition that seafaring, raiding, exploration, and trading was not about ethnicity, but about jobs. And so the reconstruction of warrior to kinship worker, it hasn't yet engaged our digital or tattoo performative cultures, but it does engage our imagination. And it does force us to rethink how these Irish freckles that I have come from elsewhere, and that they're part of an imaginary that's also part of what Leo calls our message of hope. That is, that people come here, that questions of origins, belonging, and longing evoke important reflections on categories and legacy. So after the identity crisis of 1954, Black feminists, am I pronouncing this correct, Combahee River Collective statement heightened awareness of identity politics from that 77 statement to identity politics in 1985. So genetics discloses whenever people arrived in America, all in the American continent as elsewhere in the world, blend difference. So I think what I would say in response to your statement is, on the one hand, globally, we're aware that most of us live in the umbrella of settler narratives, but migration is a global phenomenon, and it means that most of us are connected. So that not only India, China, and Turkey have complex migration histories, but the United States is home to the largest immigrant population in the world.
Right.
From nearly every country. And its immigrant population is less concentrated than other nations, contributing to its high diversity. And this diversity is resource, not burden. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm going to move on to say, what are your thoughts on his continuing the concern of Pope Francis for the poor, the immigrant, etc.?
I think this is such an important question. And I think what Francis does is he does what Augustine did in his own, you'll recall, his own kind of famous essay, his famous kind of catechism essay on doctrine. He inverts the meaning of the poor and the immigrant by saying, well, not only are the poor not a homonym, but a kind of poverty of imagination. And the immigrant experience we should look at from the perspective of the immigrant. So once again, in his 2025 essay, he says we should pivot from the abjection and victimization discourse to see the poor as missionaries of hope in countries that should welcome them. And this should revitalize our ecclesial communities against temptations of what he calls sedentarization or spiritual desertification. And he calls this an opportunity for sharing of responsibility, multilateral operation, and pursuit of the common good. Now, I only mention this because he wants to argue against kind of American prosperity and abundance discourse by speaking to the merits of desire and hope using classic Augustinian hermeneutics of resistance. And he wants to do this in a way that I think retrieves his kind of Augustinian past. And so he inverts the narrative of the other as abjection by saluting resilience and tenacity. And I think this is a kind of counter voice to a lot of what we hear about migrants.
Right. Not only within the United States, but globally these days.
Exactly. And you have to remember his personal experience of poverty. He worked with Venezuelan refugees in Peru. And so he has this kind of personal experience of the multiply oppressed, this kind of intersectional poverty in Venezuela. And so he has this sense of how these layers of complex oppressions drive people and oppress people. And so I think he wants to reinvert this like Augustine did. We recall how for Augustine, Christian doctrine retold the presumed vulgarities of Scripture with both Alexandrian allegory and Antiochian literalism from Ambrose, his teacher. So I think there's the sense in which we want to remember that Leo is using a very sophisticated way of interpreting both contemporary circumstances and historic traditions. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, indeed. But which leads me to say, and I think you really started to talk about this, the significance of the Pope's Augustinian roots as Pope. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think it's a very apt question. First of all, he self-announces in May 25. He introduces himself as an Augustinian. He calls himself a son of St. Augustine. We know from the archaeology, his parents were practicing Catholics. His father was a catechist. His mother was in rosary societies and the choir. His training and formation from his high school years, his college and graduate school years, he did a CTU MDiv. He did a licentiate, and then a doctor of canon law. He was in communities. And his canon law study of the role of local priors in the Order of St. Augustine we'll speak about later. We want to say his whole missionary training and work has been in and as an Augustinian.
Uh-huh.
Carrier of the Augustinian community. He becomes a prior provincial and a prior general through 1998 and 2013. He then becomes a bishop, and then he works at the dicastery for bishops and a cardinal between 2023 and 25. What I want to suggest to you is that his experience, both in training and as what we would call a kind of religious professional, is as in a religious community. And so as a person in a religious community, you recall in a religious community, you have a kind of vowed life. You have a community discipline of prayer.
Right.
You also have a community discipline of hearing and listening to the ambient situations which impact how God's grace is received and your response. So this Augustinian tradition, he sees authority as a service, and it doesn't evoke servitude because Francis criticized those. Now, from Augustine, in answer to your question, I think this calls forth not only this kind of early catechism that Augustine had, but especially what I would call a kind of posture of listening to the Reformation tradition on Augustine, but also a kind of classic kind of Catholic response. So this kind of theological pastoral turn is in two directions. He kind of gets this classic Catholic nature grace axis by thinking about the self in terms of one who is awake, in terms of intelligence, but also the self as will and love. The self is energy, the will is free, but also from the Reformed, especially Lutheran traditions, the sense of sin. And this sense of the sin-saturated self. And so the sin as both incompleteness and as a turning away from and toward. And then a kind of fourth element of the tragic self. And so there's a sense of the pastoral response of compassion and kindness.
Okay.
And so there's this kind of Christomorphic turn. And then finally, there are three documents that show Leo's connection to Lutherans and his Augustinian side. There's first of all a document about the communion with other traditions. So, like Lutherans, he says that full communion with other traditions is a goal, but a gift, not achievement. And then is that creation is a gift from God to be protected, not a resource to be exploited. And finally, I would say he has a forthcoming text that everybody is looking for, and that is a text named after his own papal motto, "In the one, we are one," on the promotion of communion and unity that will prioritize unity and communion within the church, based on the Augustinian theological idea that the church is one body in Christ. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, oh, indeed. Certainly apropos these days. Do you see new issues developing for the Roman Catholic Church in the United States upon his election as Pope?
Yeah, I see several that I think are pertinent that I would call relevant. First of all, there's a kind of internal debate about self-identity as both plural ethnicities and an awareness that Roman Catholic and American need not be rivals, or they need not be put out against one another. I think there's some debates among some who would like to see Catholic and American be rivals, or Roman and Catholic be rivals. And I think there's a kind of sense that the rival narrative is unnecessary because they can be fruitful for each other. So that's the first point. The second is that there's this sense that identity is more than European now, and it's beyond white assimilationism. That the white assimilationism is a kind of 19th, mid 20th century narrative that is behind us. But the challenge now is to interrogate differences and disparities and how those correlate. A third point is that we live now in a world of multipolar superpowers after the Cold War and their
Right.
A fourth is that made very clear with the COVID pandemic that we have new connectedness, both environmental, eco-biosocial, and chronic illnesses. A fourth I would call, and fifth, are the globalization debates, whether economic market justice, whether under-examined culture debates. I would also argue a January document on AI tries to get at some of those issues. And I would arguing that there's a kind of Augustinian voice with this that I think we'll get to below about the restlessness of youth and the Augustinian voice for that. Have I answered your question?
Oh, indeed, indeed. You mentioned youth, so I'm going to go on and ask this. Some people have said that Pope Leo's election might bring a renewal in Roman Catholic parish participation in the United States. In the most recent gathering of young people at the Vatican for the Jubilee of Young People, Pope Leo was enthusiastically received. What are your thoughts on this reception and renewal of parish participation?
Yeah, I think if we, for example, contrast parish participation among, say, Lutherans and among, say, Catholics, we find some very instructive differences. We find some parallels and similarities among things that are both concerns and promises, what we might say the rose and the thorn. So, for example, both congregations, we would say, are aging. So globally, Roman Catholics, 1.4 billion, Lutherans between 78 to 80 million. And in America, you have some 53 million Catholics, ELCA 2.68 million. Both those populations in America and ELCA are about 3.7 versus 3.35%. What I want to say, though, is that ethnicity-wise, whites are about 54% of Catholics in America, yet about 95% of ELCA. The challenge of racializing Christian identities are different for Catholics than for Lutherans, correct? So
Okay.
I think Spanish-speaking are a higher percentage of Catholic ethnicities than Lutheran, but Spanish-speaking Catholic ethnicities are heavily regionalized. So, for example, Guatemalans are in different regions than Salvadorians, and we see the appointments. Secondly, the immigrant status in Roman Catholic traditions are a little bit tilted differently than in Lutheran traditions, obviously because of Germanic influences, but 6 out of 10 are born in the USA, with 4 out of 10 immigrant among Catholics. 88% of Lutherans are born in the USA. So that tilts differently for Lutherans. However, the age difference among Lutherans and Catholics, 58% are above 50 in Roman Catholics, whereas 47% Lutherans. So Lutherans have, if you will, 70% of Catholics are over 50. So Lutherans have a slightly younger age population, but as will be expected, the Hispanic and Asian younger population in Catholic poses a different challenge. All that I want to say is that I think both Catholics and Lutherans have younger age populations, but I will say both face challenges of what we would call the nones and sums of affiliation. And what that
Explain that. Explain that to our listening audience.
What I would say is that poses challenges that both traditions have historically, it seems to me, posed their approaches of what I would call a kind of baptismal posture. How do we get people to be baptized or once baptized into becoming adherent or compliant with coming to church? And I think now this population in those age cohorts is not coming to church. So the question becomes not just the baptized, but going to the spaces of the young. And I think participation now means going into those apostolates, I would say in Lutheran terms, like Paul. You have to go to the Greek cities. And the Greek cities pose new challenges for Catholics because Catholic diocesan life, Catholic diocesan clergy are about 20,000, religious clergy are about 11,000, Lutheran clergy at last reach 71, 65, I believe. These clergy are heavily located in churches, local churches. Now the question becomes, how do you go to spaces where these young population who are disaffiliated are?
Right.
I pose the challenge of how do you go to places where the disaffiliated are instead of through the baptismal door lens to places where these disaffiliated are. I could have more to say about that, but I sense we're on a time crunch.
Right. But I appreciate your response. I'm going to go on to ask, what do you see the impact of Pope Leo on the global community? Any changes for the global Roman Catholic community, in your opinion?
I think the way I would put this in terms of the global Catholic community is a couple of changes that I think may be seen at a kind of macro and micro level. So I would see at the kind of macro level in terms of structures for the church, I would see that, as a matter of fact, what we have seen is that Leo has made many, many more appointments, episcopal appointments that are non-European.
Okay.
He made many more appointments in, like Francis, of people in religious communities. He has also made many more appointments of people who are credentialized in canon law, and we can talk about that separately. The reason that's important is because it shows an emphasis on a certain kind of governance and community discipline bringing to the global community. Now, also, I think it's important to see that the kind of global community that Leo has in mind is decidedly no longer European. It's also very much interested because of the religious communities he is connected with. We want to recall that there were some in the election. There were some number of religious communities that participated by Francis. 18 different religious orders were appointed by Francis as electors in the place. This has globalized not only the Curia, but Leo is continuing this, which globalized, if you will, not only the Curia and the clergy, but also globalizes participation in a way that, if you will, if you can think of clergy as no longer in the diocesan canal, all of a sudden it widens both the opportunity and the framework of participation. Finally, I would say when you want to look at the impact of Leo on kind of a global scale, I would say Leo is someone who does not extemporize. And so because he does not extemporize, there is a sense in which you want to look at how he's the first one who's had a degree in canon law since Pope Paul VI. He will delegate and he will write texts that are carefully written. And my sense is that institutionally, you will see very much a kind of delegated and canon law approach to government and constitution. by constitutional, I of course mean regulated style of deliberative consultative of community life. Have I answered?
Okay. Great. Well, it looks like our time is really running out, and I want to ask you, from your perspective as an active Roman Catholic and theologian, what are your hopes and achievements do you see or do you wish for Pope Louis XIV?
I think internally, I hope for what I would call what Prosper of Aquitaine in the sometime in the 5th century called, he used the infinitive, I'll use the gerundive, which were later applied, the lex orandi linked to the lex credendi, linked to the lex vivendi, which was added to him. That is a kind of renewal of spiritual life linked to a renewal of credendi, of believing life, linked to a renewal of the moral life linked to spirituality. And what I mean by that is specific. I think there are many lay movements that Leo has already celebrated in jubilary terms, and he shows a sign of wanting to celebrate these and lift these up. I would like to see them connected to parish life and diocesan life. I have a sense that he wants to reach out to working class migrant lives as something positive and connect them with ecclesial diocesan life beyond the narratives of please assimilate. I'm positive about that. I would like to see the kind of renewal in spiritual life that would increase language literacies. I think, for example, Spanish speaking in the United States among non-Spanish speaking populations, AI literacies in the new AI document that's coming out, a dialogue and differences beyond the kind of silos and enclaves that are familiar to academics and ecclesials and public life that become kind of polarized. I have more to say about each of those, but time is pressed.
Right. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and certainly your reflections on the election of Pope Leo XIV. Thank you so much. My guest today has been Dr. William Buckley, who is adjunct professor instructor in the Doctor of Liberal Studies program in the School of Continuing Studies, Georgetown University. And he's been talking to us and sharing with us his thoughts and reflections on the election of Pope Leo XIV. Thank you so much, William.
Pleasure to be with you, and please give my best wishes, Nelson, to our friends, and my best wishes to our audience, and I welcome the opportunity to continue any conversation.
Oh, indeed, indeed. For the Seminary Explorers, this is Nelson Strobert. Have a good day.
You have been listening to The Seminary Explorers, a production of United Lutheran Seminary with campuses in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We invite you to visit our website at unitedlutheranseminary.edu. All opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of United Lutheran Seminary or the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America.